Thank you, Bob, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me all right. So yes, I'm presenting on a collaboration on environmental leadership between the ARC Center, WorldFish, and the JCU Business School. And I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues here, some of whom are in the audience today. Sorry, hang on. Am I doing the right thing? Sorry, hang on. I'm assuming I'm doing it. I can keep going. Basically, the society's failure to achieve sustainable development, or our failure to achieve sustainable development, has been recognized as a crisis of governance. And what it means is that there's an urgent imperative to transform our approaches to environmental governance. Now, if we take adaptation to mean doing things better, transformation can be understood as doing things differently, or in resilient science speak, moving to a new domain of attraction or system configuration. The literature is converging around core conditions which are associated with more transformative change, which we're interested in. And one of these, thank you very much. Other way, thank you, is leadership. Leadership studies has existed in the management sciences for over 60 years. And our colleague Peter Case in the management sciences has traced the origins of the concept of leadership to this great man thesis of Carlyle in 1904. And he argues that this idea of the great man continues to underpin romantic notions of leadership as the heroic individual. So when I mention leadership, I imagine that many of you conjure up images of iconic men and women. For example, Achilles, Joan of Arc, Martin Luther King, Angela Merkel, Terry Hughes, perhaps. But this singular focus on individuals has been increasingly criticized within leadership studies and management sciences. Now, on first impressions, it looks like research within the environmental leadership field is reflecting this mainstream thinking in management sciences with a fairly singular focus on individual champions, brokers, and entrepreneurs. But we wanted to investigate this in more detail. So we conducted a systematic literature review to really look at how leadership is understood and analyzed within the sustainability sciences. We then borrow a framework from leadership studies, which looks at the different ways you can interpret or frame leadership. And we examine these within the context of integrated conservation and development. Now, this context of integrated conservation and development is very important for the work that we all do here. And it essentially refers to the challenge of reconciling and trading off different societal objectives related to biodiversity conservation and sustainable development. And I hope that many of you are familiar with the debate around this challenge. So very briefly, I'll present the results of our glorified Google search. I will then introduce this framework for looking at different interpretations of leadership, and we'll explore that within the context of integrated conservation and development. I'd then like to present on a research approach that we're developing to get at a more critical and in-depth analysis of leadership in practice. Our systematic literature review identified 188 relevant papers across major environmental fields, so conservation, fisheries, forestry, and water management. And we have four main findings. First, in terms of conceptualizing leadership, the sustainability sciences literature does seem to focus on individual people who, by virtue of their personality or positions, take up leadership roles or act as leaders. So within the large N studies and meta-analyses, a lot of studies simply focus on the presence or absence of a leader, but also within case studies and review papers, there is a strong focus on one or two key individuals. Relatively few papers identified multiple sources of leadership, and where they did, they saw these as synergistic. So consensus-based, moving in the same direction. Very few papers actually acknowledge that leadership can be contested or that multiple sources of leadership can work in opposition to each other. And this is an important research gap. Second, we find that a lot of the sustainability sciences literature lists many leadership, what are called competencies. So the attributes that leaders possess, the functions they perform, or the different styles of leadership that leaders can exhibit. But this focus on competencies is highly normative, which means that often they are advocated as opposed to tested. So authors are referring to what should be rather than what is in practice. Third, we find that a lot of the literature portrays leadership as this unequivocal good. So the presence of a leader is associated with successful outcomes or effective management, and the absence of a leader with stalled or ineffective management, or in fact inaction. And the language of leadership is illustrative of this. So often those who conform to or buy into a defined process, so in our case environmental management processes, and who influence these processes are identified as leaders. But those who don't align with this environmental agenda are often simply referred to as people who oppose, block, stall, or deviate from this environmental agenda, regardless of whether they actually garner a following and regardless of whether they have a legitimate counter-argument. And finally, we find that some of the literature overextends the importance of leadership. So many of the quantitative studies simply record the presence or absence of a leader, normally at community level, but they project many positive qualities onto these leaders, such as strength and commitment. And this is one of the clearest examples. So this paper by Guterres is a meta-analysis of fisheries co-management. They use a binary code to record presence or absence of a leader at community scale, but they state that the presence of at least one singular individual with entrepreneurial skills, highly motivated, respected as a local leader, and making a personal commitment to the co-management implementation process was essential. Now, you can't establish from the paper or supplementary information how the authors actually established that those leaders who were present at community scale exhibited any or all of these qualities. And what our four results suggested is that there's an opportunity for more critical and in-depth research on environmental leadership. And to start developing this, we borrow a leadership heuristic, a very simple one from leadership studies, which looks at leadership as person, position, result, and process. And we explore each of these within this context of integrated conservation and development. And our key message is that looking at leadership in any single dimension, so any single one of these, is problematic in this complex context because it is a process of negotiation over different societal objectives. And instead, you have to consider leadership as a broader concept which takes into account these different framings. To make some of the points, I'll draw on the Coral Triangle initiative, which Rebecca Weeks kindly introduced in her talk before lunch, and some of my work in the Solomons. Leadership as person. This refers to who leaders are. So Grint argues that this often tries to distill the key qualities of leaders, which are universal in nature but only possessed by few. So Gates, Branson, Jobs, for example. This is reflected in the sustainability sciences with a focus on key champions, individual champions. So you'll have heard of Virginia Chadwick and the rezoning process of the GBR. Buzz Holling as the scientific leadership of the Resilience Network, and President Yudhoyono as the initiator or political leadership behind the Coral Triangle initiative. But framing leadership simply as person is problematic within integrated conservation and development because it assumes that there's a handful of easily identified leaders and that these leaders all agree on the trajectory of change. So if we go back to President Yudhoyono, he's widely heralded as the initiator of the Coral Triangle initiative, but research by Rosen and Olsen have in fact identified up to 50 institutional entrepreneurs who worked behind the scenes to influence the priorities within the regional plan of action for the CTI. And these institutional entrepreneurs represented big international environmental NGOs, and so they appear to have influenced the priorities within the regional plan of action to a greater extent than President Yudhoyono or other political leaders of the CTI member countries. Leadership as position is about where leaders operate from. Keith Grint from the Management Sciences argues that this gives a sense of security in that those who hold a formal position of leadership have the authority and power to lead. It stems from the hierarchical nature of organizations where power is concentrated at the top. In the sustainability sciences, our review identified some papers that deal with multiple sources of leadership, and in this case they were embodied within leadership as position. But they often found or argued that these positions were synergistic or consensus-based. Leadership as position is difficult within integrated conservation and development because it assumes both consensus and that these positions are static. But in fact, my research in the Solomon Islands suggests that leadership as position is evolving, and evolving fairly rapidly in some cases. So for example, the formal leadership position of chief is the hereditary position within communities in the Solomon Islands, and it's typically held by the firstborn male of a chiefly family. Historically, the chief had the ultimate authority in community decision-making, including over issues of resource use and management. However, this is changing. So nowadays, the chiefly position is still hereditary, but other members of the chiefly family can hold this position. But it's also experiencing waning legitimacy in that other positions are gaining credibility and authority over these traditional leadership positions. So for example, in Lao Lagoon, businessmen are increasingly seen as more authoritative and more credible as community leaders than these traditional chiefs. So leadership as position has to account for the dynamics of power. Leadership as result is about what leaders achieve, and Keith Grint argues that it's one of the most difficult typologies of leadership to identify because it looks at leadership as defined by success or failure. In the sustainability sciences, an example might be the emerging or recognized leadership of, I've forgotten the name now, Al Gore, sorry. Yeah, he's clearly a very iconic leader. I can't remember. For the successful dissemination of his inconvenient truth lecture. In contrast, there is the waning leadership position of the USA in global environmental politics as a result of their failure to take meaningful action on climate change. Now, leadership as result is also problematic within integrated conservation and development because it assumes that that results work in the same direction, and that different perspectives on results would agree on what success and failure mean. Again, if we go back to Lao Lagoon and the Solomon Islands, one of the chiefs in the area of Takwa decided to take the initiative and clear-cut a large area of mangroves adjacent to the community, and to sell this as timber to the community. Now, the community found this to be a very positive outcome, and they identified this as successful leadership. Obviously, from the perspective of government NGOs and environmental scientists like ourselves, we wouldn't define this as successful leadership or a successful outcome. So because results can be multiple within integrated conservation and development, and because they are a matter of opinion, looking at leadership just as result, again, is difficult. Finally, leadership as process or practice. This is about how leaders get things done. So the management sciences, in the management sciences, context is very important for this typology. We find that while the sustainability sciences focus on competencies, does pertain to how leaders get things done. So for example, intellectual leadership depends on the power of ideas, adaptive leadership on learning, and visionary leadership on providing new meaning. We find that this is still at a fairly superficial level. So there's little information on what sorts of visions have worked, how they were developed, communicated, implemented, and so on. There's also relatively little attention paid to context in the sustainability science literature on these elements. And leadership styles are portrayed as universally understood and achievable. However, context is very important for integrated conservation and development. Biodiversity is largely concentrated in the tropics, in developing countries with urgent development needs. And in these contexts, what constitutes a legitimate process of leadership may be defined very differently from how it is in corporate, Western corporate settings or in Western environmental management settings. And we see this aspect of leadership as process as one of the key research opportunities to take forward. And we're doing this by looking at Solomon Islands' engagement in the Coral Triangle Initiative as a regional transformative initiative. So our overarching research question is, how is integrated conservation and development leadership practiced, and how does it influence which conservation and development outcomes are achieved in Solomon Islands? And we have two main components to this. The first is to identify which objectives are prioritized in policy and practice by CTI stakeholder organizations. So Rebecca listed the 5 CTI Regional Plan of Action priorities, and we're interested in which of these are reflected in policy and practice in Solomon Islands. We assume that there's a balance between these 5 objectives, and where there isn't, we are interested in whether leadership is the influence on this shift in focus. We'll get at this through interviews with National Coordination Committee members. These are individuals who represent the CTI stakeholder organizations. Second, we wish to identify who or what influences the CTI stakeholder organizations. And for this, we want to use a participatory network mapping analysis informed by actor network theory. Now, actor network theory is pretty complicated, but for our purposes, simply highlights that agency or power can be manifest through agents or actants which are not just human. So things like policies, legislation, ideologies, even fish can be vehicles through which power, influence, and so on act. And this is important if we want to get at leadership beyond this singular focus on people or position. This is what our participatory network mapping exercise might look like. Assuming I'm interviewing the NCC coordinator from the Ministry of Fisheries, we would ask them to place their organization at the center of the map. We would then ask them to identify all other organizations which influence integrated conservation and development in the Solomon Islands. At this stage, this is not about organizations that influence their activities directly, but those that have any potential influence over the outcomes of integrated conservation and development in Solomons. Now, where appropriate, they would need to break these organizations down into different departments if these organizations represent different objectives. So, for example, the Ministry of Environment might prioritize biodiversity conservation or climate change adaptation to different extents within different departments. They would then note all the policies, legislation, strategic plans, and whatever, which also potentially influence the outcomes of integrated conservation and development, on the premise that influence may happen through these structural pieces of legislation and so on, as opposed to through the organizations themselves. We would also ask the respondent to note any major discourses or ideologies which potentially influence outcomes, again, on the premise that we're interested in human and non-human actants. And finally, we would ask them to identify key individuals who may influence outcomes outside or independent of these major organizations. Once the map is complete, we would ask the individual to reflect on the activities that are achieved by their organization in terms of integrated conservation and development, and then to identify the major sources of influence. The next step is then to rank the relative importance or power of this influence according to different integrated conservation and development objectives. So they would place counters next to key influences. In this case, the grey counters represent influence over biodiversity conservation aims. So you might imagine that the Biodiversity Division of Ministry of Environment has a stronger influence over outcomes than the inshore fisheries strategy, for example. Second, they would rank the same for climate change adaptation. And finally, the white counters for ecosystem-based fisheries management and food security objectives. Now, once all respondents have completed their maps, we would aggregate the data, and both the number of links between nodes, being any of those influences, and the number of counters beside each node would represent for us leadership. And we're simply curious to know whether this broader conceptualization of leadership will identify sources of influence and meaning beyond people and position. So if you're interested in the outcomes, please do follow up with us. So to conclude, environmental leadership is a growing concern of sustainability science, in particular resilience science. The way it's conceptualized reflects mainstream leadership studies in this focus on individuals. And this focus is also highly normative, so advocates what leadership should be rather than investigating what leadership is in practice. We've tried to demonstrate that taking a singular approach on leadership is problematic within the context that we work, because integrated conservation and development is a process of negotiation. And finally, we're developing a research approach because we see leadership in practice as one of the key opportunities that have come out of the previous two sections. We'll be doing fieldwork at the end of this year and hope to have further outcomes next year and the year after. Thanks very much for your time.